Hi there Vanguard fans, this is extremewirehead, and I have just basically completed every single clan that is available in Cardfight Vanguard as of mid-2017. And with this number of different clans, I think you've already seen the different ways that the game plays, the different ways that it evolved, and the kind of ways that you have to think. But I think when talking to a beginner, when talking about how a beginner should think, probably the most important thing is just to give them a couple of tips, because the game can be a bit stressful, it can be a bit complicated and overly dramatic. Understanding exactly the number of pieces and things to watch out for can be a bit daunting at first. In this video, I want to look at 4 things that I think they should really focus on, because it is the foundation by which everything else builds upon. When we look at this list, I want you to pay attention to these 4 things and to watch out for them very, very carefully, because they are probably what's going to set you up for a great game later. The first thing I want to look at is probably the most important thing. Ever since the Stride generation started with the GBT series, we've got the most important rule of all, which I think is always stride. When in doubt, stride if you have the option to stride. The most important skill in, not really skill, the most important mechanic in the Vanguard universe is the drive check and the ability to draw extra cards. By being able to remove a G3 from your hand and gaining an extra card that can possibly block, having the ability to trigger on an extra card, means that striding by its very nature is very powerful. And because of the number of cards that you can filter through over the course of a game, which amounts to, I would say on average, an extra 5 cards by the end of the game, it is very important that you stride religiously. It is the most important thing. And it's because of this that we can move on to number 2, which I think is almost as important as number 1. Watch the drive checks. By understanding that the drive checks are open knowledge, when you go up against somebody and then you watch them drive check, make sure you take note of the grades that show up. The first cards that show up are probably the most important, because they tell you more than half of what the opponent's hand probably has. This means that by the end of the game, you've got a good sense of exactly what cards are in their hand. If you notice that they have a bunch of G1s and G2s, maybe don't hit their G1s and G2s, because it's very easy to replace. If you see that it's a bunch of triggers, you know that they have a high defensive value, and I would suggest aiming for magic numbers that trip them up. For example, if you see that they've got a hand of at least 20,000 guard, why not make them guard for 15 and make it really awkward? There are a number of different ways, there are a number of different ideas, philosophies, planning. Everything can boil down to knowing exactly what shows up in their hand, what grades show up, how they're going to plan around it, and being able to adjust your plan according to what you see on your drive check and what your opponent sees on their drive check is going to be very important. Keep track of this, and remembering this is probably one of the harder things to do, especially when you're really getting into a fight, but it is something that you should take note of very carefully. The third thing I want to look at is something that you should be watching throughout the game. Over the course of the game, you're going to, much like in every other Bushiroad card game, it tends to move towards a climactic finish. By that I mean, both sides hit each other really hard, and they hit each other to the point until somebody knocks down. Now, as we slowly hit each other to reach that breaking point of amazing stuff happening, we tend to increase the number of resources that we gain to make sure that we have the counterblast, the soul, to pay for the different costs that are in play. For the case of many of the Dark Soul clans, you're going to have to watch out for the soul. For many of the rearguard centric clans, you're going to have to watch out for the rearguard, such as Aquaforce. But in general, you have to watch for these resources. Maybe sometimes the more important thing is to attack the rearguard, because their attacking pattern requires rearguards. Maybe it's more important that you do not attack with your third attacker, because you do not want to give them the third, the fourth, the fifth counterblast. Probably the most important thing to track here is knowing, which takes a bit of practice, I know, it's knowing exactly how many counterblasts they need to pull off the combinations that they require. Understanding this takes a lot of memorization and learning about the different plays that they can have. But the more important thing is know that if you can hit certain thresholds, be very careful about the kinds of resources that affect those things. Addendum, or more like a side note, if you're keeping track of resources, make sure that you try to make it very good for you in terms of heals. You do not want to get into a situation where heals will be bad for you. As much as possible, try to make sure that the heals are always in a positive light, and when they're active, you do extend your gameplay slightly, which is always a good thing. And finally, and I think this is the most important thing and something to especially think about when playing the game. When you buy a starter deck, when you start out, you can learn a lot of different things from the basic cards. Over time, you will be forced to switch out to new cards, especially as time goes by, you get ideas, you see new cards, you buy new cards and all of that. Make sure to experiment thoroughly. Some of the things that people do is they switch out a card and they think that, oh, it feels slightly better with this card. I wouldn't put too much hope on that unless you've played over, I would say, at least 5 games, at best 10 games, to gauge exactly how this change and many of the changes that you make to your deck affect the overall game plan. Make sure that you experiment extensively. Vanguard is a game that requires a lot out of those 50 cards, and that means that any small changes do have quite a lasting effect. Even by changing a card into a 2-card combo, into a 3-card combo, or a 4-card combo makes an especially large difference in the game. Remember that the most important thing in the game right now is not to get grade locked, or if you choose to get grade locked, try to stick to G1, because G2 would mean that your opponent has the option of fielding into a stride even without you. Be very conscious of this. It means that as long as you can get one G1, one G2, and one G3 in your hand, you're in a pretty good spot. This means that overall, in all honesty, you really need only a minimum of one G1, one G2, one G3. If that is correct, the minimum number of G1, G2s that you require inside of your deck is actually 8 pieces each. This means that the numbers that people throw around, like the 8, 11, and 14 of the grades, do have an effect, and I'm not discounting that fact. But the numbers are so low that you can actually play around with it if you want to use 13 G1s, if you want to use an extra G2, if you want to use 2 extra G2s, if you want to play around with some of the funnier G0s and some of the amazing plays like Hagakure. Experiment, try them out, put 1 copy, put 2 copies. You'll be amazed by how big of a difference it can make to the fight if you draw into them. As another point of discussion here, the game does try to push you into using 4 heals, it does try to push you to using 4 G-guards, but remember that you have a stride deck of 16 cards. It means that, in all honesty, the stride deck is a very, very simple form of a Swiss Army knife. You will almost never use every single piece for every single fight. This means that sometimes it might even be better to cull some of these choices, reduce the number of choices, and try to stick to a couple of surefire techniques. This opens up your space to use more G-guards. I know that you are very much in love with some of the strides and some of the plays, and in completeness, for the sake of understanding, you do only get to use 4 G-guards over the course of a game. But the most important thing is the fact that having these G-guards, having these options, using the Cray Elementals, they can offer you so many different options. You can put in many different pieces that can deal with certain things. Dismal makes anything that attacks not hit, and all of these fancy plays makes it for a very, 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 very interesting case where you have the G-guard for the exact position that you might set yourself up into. This means that experimenting with more than one of every G-guard, making it so that you have maybe 6, maybe even 7 G-guards when you're only going to use at most 4, might not be such a bad idea. Sometimes the enemy might trip you up, sometimes you might not be in the perfect situation to use the special G-guards that are made for your class, but it is very important that sometimes you put in those dashes of utility. The fact that you can choose any card inside your G deck means that you have the option to use any card that is available, and it will be effective. This means that even if it isn't effective, keep track of the number of times that you use these G guards, keep track of the number of times you use certain strides, and make sure that only the ones that you use consistently over the course of many different fights stays. It is a good idea sometimes to have all these fancy things for specific situations, but really you should stick to your core and try to work around that. Much like any other card game and much like many other games in general, your most important thing is understanding how to take advantage of your strengths. And the utility of the stride deck is probably one of the most different things in Cardfight Vanguard right now, and it's something to watch out for because of the importance that it leads into your games. Anyway, this has been Extreme Wirehead. Keep note of these 4 things: stride, watch the drive checks of both players, keep track of your resources, and always experiment with the cards inside your deck. Again, this has been Extreme Wirehead. I hope you're enjoying Cardfight Vanguard. If you have any questions, anything at all, just leave me a comment. I try to answer as quickly as possible. It is definitely a game that has quite a bit of luck involved, but there are so many different variables that you can change that I think it does offer the amount of clarity, that just enough clarity to make it what you need it to be. Anyway, that's it for me. I'll see you next time.